Good deal. You ready for the word?
Yes, sir.
Absolutely.
Turn to John chapter 4 and 2 Kings chapter 17 again, please. In verse 19 of John 4, the woman said unto him, Sir, I perceive that you're a prophet. Now I want you to pay attention to verse 19. It says, the woman said. Well, who is this woman? All right. She's a woman from Samaria. We are told that in the verses before that. So what's the significance of that? What significance does that have? She is from Samaria. Well, Samaria can be a reference to two things. It's a city. There is a city that bears that name, and there's also a region that bears that name. The best way I know to illustrate it is that if you meet somebody and you say, where are you from? And they say, well, I'm from Birmingham. You very well could follow up with this question, what part of Birmingham? And they're not going to say north, south, east, or west. More than likely, what they're going to say to you is, or you could even say to them, well, when you say you're from Birmingham, where are you from? Are you from Birmingham? Are you from Hoover? Are you from Homewood? Are you from Midfield, Bessemer, Irondale, Roebuck, Center Point? What part of Birmingham? All of these cities make up a region known as Birmingham. There is a city of Birmingham, and then there is a region of Birmingham, where the same thing applies to Samaria. There was a city called Samaria, but there's also a region known as Samaria. The city of Samaria was purchased by Omri, O-M-R-I. He was, I think, the third or fourth king of Israel after Jeroboam. And he purchased the city of Samaria, and he made that to be the capital city of the northern kingdom. But the 10 tribes who made up this northern kingdom, and we've talked about that, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail this morning about it, but there were, after the death of Solomon, the kingdom split. You had Rehoboam became the king of the southern kingdom. Come on in, good morning. Rehoboam became the king of the southern kingdom, and Jeroboam became the king of the northern kingdom, which had 10 tribes. But the 10 tribes we saw in our study, the 10 tribes got expelled out of the land. Do you remember why they got expelled? Why they were taken out of the land? Okay. We looked at this last week, actually, in 2 Kings 17. We were given a list of the reasons, and the reasons were that they had transgressed against the laws of Yahweh, and their transgressions had become so blatant that Yahweh removed them, it said, out of his sight. We read that 4 or 5 times where it says he removed them out of his sight, because he had said that previously. If you forsake my law, you'll be driven out of my sight. And so they were driven out of his sight. Now, before we read any more in John 4, I want to go back to 2 Kings 17 and see what happens to the land once those 10 tribes, the people of those 10 tribes, are either slaughtered or they're driven out of it. One of those two things happened to them when they transgressed against Yahweh. Assyria came in and either slaughtered them or packed them up and walked them out of there. And the way they walked them out of there was hideous. It is said that they would take the people in cities and regions and they'd line them up and march them somewhere else, and that they would take fish hooks and run it through their noses and hook this one to the one behind them and that one to the one behind them, and that's the way they led them out of the city. But let's read what happens to the land once they're expelled. You're in 2 Kings 17? Look in verse 6. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria took Samaria and carried Israel away into Assyria. So he took Samaria, the capital city, and then he takes Israel, the 10 tribes of Israel, away into Assyria, and he placed them in Halah and in Habor by the river of Gozan, and in the city of the Medes. For so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against Yahweh their Elohim, which had brought them up out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other Elohims. So we're told why they're taken out, but we're told that the land was emptied of the 10 tribes. They're taken out. Well, it can't remain empty, so what does the king of Assyria do? Look in verse 24. And the king of Assyria brought men from Babylon, and from Cutha, and from Avah, and from Hamath, and from Sepharvaim, and placed them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel, and they possessed Samaria and dwelt in the cities thereof. So verse 24 is a perfect example of what I was talking about earlier when I mentioned Birmingham. You see there it says they were placed in the cities of Samaria. So Samaria is not just a city, it's a region containing many cities. So they possessed Samaria. Who is they? They possess that region. Who is they? The people from Babylon, Cutha, Avah, Hamath, and Sepharvaim, which are all Gentile people. Babylon, people from Babel. Cutha is a region of Assyria. Avah is a region of Syria. Sepharvaim, a region of Assyria. And Hamath is a region of Syria. So these are all what Hebrew would refer to as Goy, or Gentiles, or strangers. So the 10 tribes are no longer in this land. They're gone. The land that was once occupied by Israel, part of the promised land given to Abraham, is now occupied wholly by various Gentile nationalities. Everybody see that? So from this point on, when a Samaritan is mentioned, up until this point, when you mentioned Samaritans, you were talking about some member of the 10 tribes of Israel. But from this point on, when you mention a Samaritan, you're no longer talking about any member of one of the 10 tribes. You're talking about a Goy. You're talking about a Gentile. This is important to know. The woman at the well, go back to John 4. The woman at the well in John 4 was from Samaria. She's a Gentile. She's not connected to Israel anyway. But she likes to talk like she's connected to Israel. We'll come back to 2 Kings in a moment, but let's listen to some of the things that this woman said. Verse 12. She said to the Messiah, "Are you greater than our father Jacob, which gave us the well and drank thereof himself and his children and his cattle?" So she's claiming that Jacob is her father. Jacob's not her father. She's a woman of Samaria. She's come out of a Gentile nation. Samaria had been repopulated with Gentiles. Look in John chapter 4, verse 20. "Our fathers worshipped in this mountain, and you say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship." Worship in the mountain areas of Samaria. Come on in, Bob, have a seat. Worship in the mountain areas of Samaria was set up and established by Jeroboam, the first king of Israel. Remember, he made the 2 bulls, golden calves. He set them up in Dan and Bethel. Samaria becomes the capital. Those mountainous areas become the places where they commit their whoredoms against Yahweh by worshiping other Elohims. Well, she's claiming now to have a heritage that connects her to the kings of Israel who set all of this up. Verse 25. "The woman said unto him, I know that Messiah comes, which is called the Anointed One. When he is come, he'll tell us all things." So she knows enough to even know that a Messiah is to come. She's of a Gentile origin. Well, how is it that she knows these things and claims this connection? How is it that this woman who came from a Gentile nation knows to claim to be connected to Jacob, knows to claim that the kings are part of her heritage? How does she know about a Messiah? Well, let's go back to 2 Kings 17. 2 Kings 17 is going to tell us exactly how this woman from Samaria knew these things. We're going to read several verses here. Look in verse 25. "And so it was at the beginning of their dwelling there," we're talking about those Gentile nations, "they feared not Yahweh." They didn't fear him because they didn't know who he was. They couldn't worship him. They couldn't acknowledge him. They didn't know who he was. "Therefore Yahweh sent lions among them, which slew some of them. Wherefore they, these Gentile people, spoke to the king of Assyria, saying, the nations which you have removed and placed in the cities of Samaria know not the manner of the Elohim of the land. Listen to it. The nations which you removed, they were Gentiles living in their own land. The king of Assyria took them out of their land and moved them to Samaria. They're saying, you put us here and we know nothing about the manners of the Elohim of this land. Therefore he sent lions among us, or among them, and behold, they slay them, because they know not the manner of the Elohim of the land. So they believed that Elohims were connected to a geographical area. And they said, we knew the Elohim of Babylon, or the Elohims of Babylon. We knew the Elohims of Avah and Hamath, but we don't know what Elohim has claimed this land. And we don't know what to do to appease him. Verse 27. Then the king of Assyria commanded, saying, carry there one of the priests whom you brought from thence, who you brought out of the land. Let them go and dwell there, and let him teach them the manner of the Elohim of the land. So the king of Assyria says, well, all right, we got a problem. Here's the way we're going to fix it. We're not going to send a dozen or more priests. We're going to send one. You see that? Carry there one of the priests. Right. Let him, it says, teach them the manner of that Elohim. Well, let's think about what he just did for a moment. Not many priests, not a lot of priests, one priest, let him teach, that's singular. And one priest is being sent back to teach the people the manner of the Elohim of the land. Let me ask you this, how good a job do you expect that he will do? The king of Assyria didn't say, well, go down to Jerusalem and get the most qualified priest they have and bring him up. He said, go get one of the priests that we drove out of this land and send him back here. All right? The practice of Jeroboam, we were told in 1 Kings chapter 12, verse 31, the practice of Jeroboam when he set up this contaminated religion was to make the lowest of the people priest. Now we're almost 200 years removed from that, and it's gotten worse and worse and worse over 200 year span of time. Israel was overthrown by Assyria and removed because they had transgressed the law of Yahweh. They don't even know how to follow the law of Yahweh. The priests were doing a pitiful job of teaching them how to walk in Torah. So what we saw last week is that the priest and the people had begun to mingle in pagan rituals associated with other Elohims. That's the reason they're driven out of the land. So this is a priest who's going to get sent back to teach these Gentiles how to worship Yahweh. Pick up in verse 28. Then one of the priests whom they had carried away from Samaria came and dwelt in Bethel and taught them how they should fear Yahweh. Doesn't say taught them right. Doesn't say taught them properly. Doesn't say taught them how to walk in Torah. It says that he came and he taught them how to fear Yahweh, how they should fear Yahweh. Well, what does he know about the fear of Yahweh? Nothing. The next verse reveals that he didn't know anything about the fear of Yahweh. Verse 29, howbeit every nation made Elohims of their own, put them in the houses of the high places which the Samaritans had made, every nation in their cities wherein they dwelt. Now, the word translated there, howbeit, really shouldn't be there. It's more accurate for it to say and. In other words, these Gentile nations inside of Samaria did not do what verse 29 says they did. They did not do that despite the priest was teaching them otherwise. It was not, okay, Mr. Priest, thank you for teaching us about Yahweh. We'll worship him too, but we're going to go on worshiping our Elohims that we brought with us from our land. That's not what happened. They did this not despite what the priest was teaching them. They did this because that's what the priest was teaching them to do. That's what he had taught Israel to do. He was teaching them how to take their pagan practices from the Elohims they had worshipped in the foreign land and how to rededicate those to Yahweh. That's all he was doing. And so that's exactly what verse 29 says he did. Listen to Young's literal translation of these two verses. It reads this way. And one of the priests whom they removed from Samaria came in and dwelt in Bethel, and he is teaching them how they are to fear Yahweh. And they are making each nation its gods and place them in the houses of the high places that the Samaritans have made, each nation in their cities where they are dwelling. So Young's literal translation uses the word and instead of however. And lets us know they weren't opposing what the priests were saying. They were doing what that priest had told them to do. Everybody with me there? Priests taught them how to blend the practices from pagan worship with the worship of Yahweh. Let's continue, verse 30. And the men of Babylon made Succoth Benoth. That means the tent of women. And the men of Cuth made Nergal. And the men of Hamath made Ashima. And the Avites made Nibhaz and Tartak. And the Serphavites burnt their children in fire to Adrimelech and Anamelech, the Elohims of Sepharvaim. So, listen, the writer of Kings is explaining this to us. So, they feared Yahweh and made unto themselves of the lowest of them priests of the high places, which sacrificed for them in the houses of the high places. They feared Yahweh and served their own Elohims after the manner of the nations whom they carried away from there. Do you see what he said? This priest came in and taught them to do exactly what Israel was doing when Israel got driven out. He taught them how to take pagan practices and dedicate those to Yahweh. It didn't work for Israel. It's not going to work for them. These new inhabitants, these various Gentile nations who have come into the land, have been taught to fear Yahweh and serve their own Elohims. Listen to this, what it says. After the manner of. After the manner of. In other words, these Gentiles have been taught how to fear Yahweh and serve other Elohims in exactly the same way Israel was doing it before they got expelled. You see that? It's very important to pay attention to that point. It says plainly they were taught to fear Yahweh and serve their own Elohims. They were taught how to do that. Well, let's go back up a few verses and remind yourselves of why Israel got removed from the land. Look in verse 17. In verse 7. For so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against Yahweh their Elohim, which had brought them up out of the land of Egypt from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and had feared other Elohims. Listen, they walked in the statutes of the heathen, whom Yahweh cast out from before the children of Israel and of the kings of Israel, which they had made. The word translated statutes there means the appointed times and the customs of the heathen. They're keeping the holy days of the heathen. They're just dedicating them to Yahweh. They're keeping the customs of the heathen. They're just saying, well, in our heart, we're doing this for Yahweh because we're in His land. Are you with me? Yeah. Verse 9, and the children of Israel did secretly those things that were not right against Yahweh their Elohim. Anybody remember what we said last week about that word secretly? It does not mean they were hiding doing these things. It means they were hiding the true origin of the things they were doing. They didn't go in a place and hide and do this worship of other Elohims. They took the worship of other Elohims and hid the origin and the meaning of it. Brought it in and said, we are doing this for Yahweh. Not for Ishtar, not for Tammuz. We're doing this for Yahweh. Are you with me? All right. Well, it did not work. He'll not accept it. He cast Israel out. So let's go back down to verse 34. This is what the Gentiles are being taught to do. Israel tried it. It didn't work. Judah is getting deeper and deeper and deeper into it. They're going to find out 160, 70 years later, it won't work for them either. These Gentiles have been brought in, and they are being taught how to do it. How to take pagan rituals and dedicate them to Yahweh. Well, Yahweh wouldn't accept it then. He won't accept it now. Look in verse 34. Unto this day they do after the former manners. They feared not Yahweh. Neither do they after their statutes or after their ordinances or after the law, Torah, and commandment which Yahweh commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel. Now verse 33 and verse 34 may sound like a contradiction, but they're not. The writer's simply making a point. In verse 33, he is communicating to us, they feared Yahweh and served their own Elohims, after the manner of the nations whom they carried away from that. The fear of Yahweh they had was a fear that they had been taught. Let me say that again. The fear of Yahweh that they had was a fear that they had been taught, and he qualifies what that fear was. We're going to make a good point if you just hang in here with me. The fear of Yahweh they had was a fear that they had been taught, and that fear was we can worship him and we can use pagan practices to do it. We just have to rededicate them to him. They were taught they could worship Yahweh with the rituals and customs of other Elohims. Well, they were being eaten by lions, right, before this started. They did not want to give up the religions and the religious rituals they were doing, but they didn't want to get eaten by lions anymore either. So they're taught that Yahweh is the Elohim who abides in that land, and they were taught that they could take the things they were already doing and just do them for Yahweh instead of for somebody else. Does that sound familiar? Is that not exactly what the Roman Catholic Church did? Whatever pagan ritual there was that came out of Rome, they didn't try to convert the people from it. They just baptized that ritual and said, we'll do this for the Messiah, or we'll do this for Yahweh. This is exactly what verse 33 is telling us it took place. Verse 34 is the summary statement of the author of 2 Kings. And he's writing inspired by the Ruach HaKodesh, inspired by the Holy Spirit, and he says plainly, they fear not Yahweh. They feared him after the manner they were taught. Right. But he said they do not fear Yahweh. How does he know they don't fear Yahweh? He explains it in the next verse. Let's read verse 34 and 35 together. Unto this day they do after the former manners. They fear not Yahweh, neither do they after their statutes or after their ordinances or after Torah and commandment which Yahweh commanded the children of Jacob, whom he named Israel, with whom Yahweh had made a covenant and charged them, saying, you shall not fear other Elohims, nor bow yourselves to them, nor serve them, nor sacrifice to them. So when he says they did not fear Yahweh, he's basing that on Torah. He is saying that Torah forbids the use of any practice associated with the heathen worship of a god. If you practice or participate in any such ritual, you're not keeping Torah. And if you're not keeping Torah, you don't fear Yahweh. Verse 36. But Yahweh, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt with great power and a stretched out arm, him shall you fear, and him shall you worship, and to him shall you do sacrifice. So the writer of Kings, inspired by the Ruach HaKodesh, says they don't fear Yahweh. It's impossible to fear Yahweh and mingle, contaminate the worship of Yahweh with practices from other deities. The problem he saw in these new people that came into the land and to the people that got driven out, this author I'm talking about, the problem he saw was the same problem we see today. Yahweh's not feared. There is no fear of Yahweh. People are taught they can command him what to do. And if you don't think you are powerful enough to command him what to do, just get you a prayer chain going, because he can't refuse a prayer chain. Right? So people are running around trying to tell him what to do, and they're being taught that they don't have to listen to what he's telling them to do. Yahweh's not feared. A person cannot say they fear Yahweh and ignore what he says. You can't say you fear Yahweh and ignore what he says about the Sabbath. You can't say you fear Yahweh and ignore what he says about the practices of the heathen. You can't say you fear Yahweh and ignore what he says about images. You can't say, I fear Yahweh, and ignore what he says about clean and unclean. You can't say you fear Yahweh and ignore what he says about anything. Well, that's the point being made here in 2 Kings 17. The fear of Yahweh is always evidenced by obedience to his instruction. So let's keep reading. Look in verse 37. And the statutes and the ordinances and the law and the commandment which he wrote for you, you shall observe to do forevermore. You shall not fear other Elohims. And the covenant that I've made with you, you shall not forget. Neither shall you fear other Elohims. But Yahweh your Elohim you shall fear. And he shall deliver you out of the hand of all your enemies. Howbeit, they did not hearken, but they did after their former manner. So these nations, mark that, these nations feared Yahweh and served their graven images. Both their children and their children's children, as did their fathers, so do they unto this day. So the writer of Kings wants us to understand who got moved into this land, what happened to them, how they were taught. Even though there is a smidgen of truth among them, there's a lot of contamination among them too. Listen to verse 41 again. We're being told about the people who now occupy the land of Israel, where the 10 tribes used to live. These nations, that's the word goy, it refers to Gentiles, it refers to foreigners. These nations are being taught something, and what are they being taught? To fear Yahweh and serve graven images. Generation after generation. The writer said, so do they even to this day. Samaria, once occupied by the 10 tribes, is now occupied by Gentile nations who have been handed down a contaminated form of worship. John 4. In John 4, a woman of Samaria came to the well. Based on 2 Kings 17, what do we know about her? Here's what we know. We know that she's from a land that has been taught a contaminated form of worship of Yahweh. She has been taught that she can and should fear Yahweh, but that she can also use pagan practices to worship him. Knowing that, we can better understand why the Messiah, in verse 22, looked her square in the eyes and said to her, woman, you worship you know not what. Right. 2 Kings 17 explains why he could say that to her. She had been taught wrong. It had been handed down from generation to generation. It was from that time to the children and the children's children and the children's children's children. It gets handed down, a contaminated form of worship. You declare your allegiance to Yahweh, but you don't have to do everything He says. Her condition's our condition. Or was. It was what we were taught. Our worship was contaminated without our knowledge, just as hers was. Let me show you what I mean. If you got electronic scriptures, you can do this just as well probably, but if you've got your Bible in your hand, look in 2 Kings 17, John 4, and I want you to connect two verses together. They go together. Connect 2 Kings 17:9. I went in my Bible and put a note at 2 Kings 17:9, and I wrote out beside it John 4:22. And then I went to John 42, and I wrote in the margin beside it 2 Kings 17:9, because the two verses go together. 2 Kings 17:9 says the children of Israel did secretly those things that were not right against Yahweh their Elohim. Secretly means what? To act covertly. The pagan rituals were given new meaning and brought into the worship of Yahweh. In other words, the secret is you're showing up on the first Sunday after the first full moon, after the spring equinox, thinking you're celebrating the resurrection. But in fact, this day is really connected to the worship of Tammuz and Ishtar. You follow me? Yeah. So the true meaning of all of that gets hidden in something else, and it's secret. And so you're doing it. When it first started, people may have resisted a little bit, but by the time you get to children and children's children and generation after generation, now you got people who are taught that everything we're doing is for Yahweh. Whether it's Christmas, Easter, Halloween, it doesn't matter. We dedicate it all to Yahweh. So when I do this, secretly now, even though the secret is it's pagan. But people think they're doing it for Yahweh. Right? Now, you look in John 4:22, He said to the woman, you worship, you know not what. She would have been convinced she was worshiping Yahweh. But the Messiah says to her, because so many things have secretly been hidden in your religion and contaminated it, you're worshiping and you don't even know what you're worshiping or who you're worshiping. How do you worship and not know who you're worshiping? It's easy. Generation after generation of pagan rituals are brought in secretly and get assigned new meaning. They're so good at doing it that you get generations of people who do not even know that the Messiah was not born on December the 25th. They do not know that they shouldn't even acknowledge that day because it's associated with Solus Invictus, the pagan day in which they celebrate the birth of the unconquered sun. They do not know that the first day of the first full moon after the vernal equinox has absolutely nothing to do with the resurrection. They do not know it's a day associated with Tammuz and Nimrod and Babylonian fertility deities. There are generations now who do not even know that Lent has absolutely nothing to do with the Messiah or His death or His burial or His resurrection. They do not know that sunrise services are pagan. They do not know that Easter is the name of a fertility deity. It is not the name of an event celebrating a resurrection. The very word Easter is the name of a fertility god. because it's been secretly hidden in the worship for decades and generations, people are worshiping and they don't know what they're worshiping. Right. These things have been hidden so well into the worship of Yahweh that multitudes think they're worshiping Him. But the truth is the worship has been so contaminated that He will not receive it. They worship and they know not what. The sins of Samaria are the sins of America. America worships, but they know not why. I want to close this morning by sharing with you how a person can know if their worship is pure or if their worship is contaminated. After looking at this, the sins of Samaria and the sins of America are the same. And the sin of Samaria is they have a contaminated worship. We need to know if our worship of Yahweh is pure or contaminated. And the things I'm going to share with you are not my opinion. They're not my thoughts. I'm going to share with you what Messiah said about this subject. If you want to know if your worship of Yahweh is pure or contaminated, listen to what he said about it. In John chapter 4, verse 22, he said, salvation is of the Jews. If you do not know that or understand that, then your worship is contaminated. And there's a whole lot of garbage that's been brought in to your belief system that will not save you. Your belief system is contaminated. John 4:22, he said to her, you worship, you know not what. We know what we worship, for salvation is of the Jews. Notice he did not say, woman, if you just believe in me and say this prayer. Right. She needs more than that. He wanted her to know that she and her people were way off base. And he said to her, we, who is we? We Jews, right. We know who we worship. Not to say they don't stumble, not to say they don't mess up, but he said, we know who we worship. Yeah. And he said to her, salvation is of the Jews. What does that mean? Salvation is of the Jews. Should we just, now that he's been resurrected, should we just ignore that? No. He said salvation is of the Jews. I think Paul explained it perfectly in Romans chapter 3. Romans 3 verse 1. What advantage then has the Jew? Or what profit is there of circumcision? Now listen, this is written 90 years, 100 years after the resurrection. Right. And Paul says, what advantage does a Jew have? And you would think that the answer would be none. If you listen to folks talk, you think it would be none. Right. But listen to what his answer is. Much every way. Yeah. What advantage does he have? He has a lot of advantage. Right. Much advantage. Every way you can imagine, he has advantage. Why does he have an advantage? Chiefly, what's the main reason he has an advantage? Because that unto them were committed the oracles of Yahweh. Unto them were committed the oracles of Yahweh. The word oracles means utterances. Yahweh uttered things. Yahweh said things. He spoke truth. He had what he was saying written down. Then he took what he had said and that was written down, and he gave it to the Jews and said, guard this. Protect this. They have endured hatred and hardship in fulfilling that duty, but they have guarded it and they have protected it. This is why the Messiah said salvation is of the Jews, because in their possession are the utterances of Yahweh. The word of, salvation is of the Jews, is the Greek word ek. Ek means to come out from. So Messiah is saying salvation comes out from the Jews. Salvation has its origin in the Jews. If you want to know about salvation, you got to go look at the oracles that they were entrusted with. If you want to know how to be rescued and safe, you got to go look at the utterances and the instructions that Yahweh gave to them. Right. If you've been taught a salvation that's not based on the instruction given to the Jews through Torah, then your worship is contaminated. Right. We all worship, we did. We worshiped and we did not know who we were worshiping. We were worshiping Ishtar and didn't know we were. We were worshiping Tammuz, did not know we were. We were worshiping Mithra, did not know we were. We were worshiping demons, did not know we were. Why? Because we were never taught Torah. Had we been taught Torah, the instruction Yahweh uttered to the Jews through Moses, then we would have known better than to have crucifixes. We'd have known better than to have steeples. We'd have known better than to have Easter services and wreaths and egg hunts and celebrations of December the 25th, but we weren't taught. We were taught that those things were ways we could honor Yahweh. We didn't know any better because we didn't know what Yahweh had said to the Jews. Had we known what He had said to the Jews and known that salvation comes out from them, we would have rejected all those pagan practices we were taught. Salvation, how to be rescued and how to be saved, comes from the Jews. I want you to contrast the Messiah's words with what some pastors and some evangelists or some Sunday school teachers have said. They say just believe in your heart, call on the name of Jesus, and you'll be saved. That's all you got to do. Right. But Messiah said salvation is of the Jews. If salvation is of the Jews, and if Yahweh's utterances have been entrusted to them, then is it not imperative that we know what He said to them as part of our salvation? People have a false hope about salvation because they know nothing about Torah and they misread Paul. Go to Romans 10. Listen to what verse 5 says. Moses describes the righteousness which is of the law. The word for law is Torah. Moses describes the righteousness which is of Torah. The man which doeth those things shall live by them. Notice what verse 5 says. It's opposite of what people tell you. People tell you that trying to keep the law is death. They tell you it's bondage. They tell you it can't be done. But Moses described the righteousness which is of the law, and that is, if a man does them, he'll live by them. They bring life. Here's what Yahweh said. When Yahweh gave Torah, He said, I'm setting before you life and death. I'm setting before you blessing and cursing. And then in case we couldn't figure it out on our own, He said, choose life. Which means what? Choose Torah. Choose to obey. You'll be blessed and you'll live. Yes, sir. Well, that's what Romans 10:5 is talking about. Righteousness which is of the law is do them and you'll live. Verse 6, but, so Greek word day can be translated but, it can also be translated and, it can also be translated moreover. So we could say it this way, the man that does those things shall live by them, moreover, and the righteousness which is of faith speaks on this wise, say not in your heart, who shall ascend into heaven? That's to bring the Messiah down from above. Or who shall descend into the deep? That's to bring up Messiah again from the dead. But what says it? The word is nigh you, even in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith which we preach. That if you shall confess with your mouth the Master Yeshua, you shall believe in your heart that Yahweh raised Him from the dead, you shall be saved. For with the heart man believes unto righteousness, and with the mouth confession is made unto salvation. For the Scripture says, whosoever believes on Him shall not be ashamed. For there is no difference between the Jew and the Greek. For the same master over all is rich in all that call upon his name. For whosoever shall call upon the name of Yahweh shall be saved. How then? All right, so that's where most people stop. They just stop and say, well, all I got to do is believe, call on his name, I'm saved, everything's fixed. I'm going to go on about my life the way I was living it before. But listen to what he says, verse 14. How then shall they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how shall they believe in him of whom they have not heard? And how shall they hear without a preacher? And how shall they preach except they be sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of them that preach the gospel of peace and bring glad tidings of good things. But they have not all obeyed the gospel, for Isaiah said, Yahweh, who has believed our report? So then, faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Yahweh. In other words, what Paul said is, I want you to believe in your heart and confess with your mouth. But what you're going to believe in is the things that you were taught that was entrusted to the Jews about this Messiah that will come and walk perfectly in Torah. You see? Faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Yahweh, by the oracles of Yahweh, by the utterances of Yahweh. Salvation is of the Jews. On the day of judgment, Messiah is not going to say, depart from me, you who believed in me and then also tried to keep Torah. That's absurd. What does he say? Depart from me, ye who work in lawlessness. Right. You who are lawless. You who thought that you could be saved and represent me, but ignore the utterances of my Father, depart from me. Right. Salvation is of the Jews. So how do you examine to see if your worship of Yahweh is contaminated? First, see if your salvation is rooted in the truths that Yahweh gave to the Jews. If it's not, your worship is contaminated. Number two, compare the doctrines you're taught to the doctrines taught in Torah. So first of all, salvation is of the Jews. So I have to make a change in my thinking and come to the place that I understand that what he said in the back of that book wasn't just for them, it's for me. If salvation comes out of the Jews, then what's called the Old Testament isn't just for the Jews. It's for anybody that wants to be saved. Right? So I got to change my thinking. Because people are being taught today, don't pay attention to that was for Israel or that's for the Jews. All those Moedim and feasts, all of those Sabbaths and all that dietary stuff, that's just for the Jews. It's not for us. Messiah said salvation comes out from the Jews. So I change my thinking and I say, okay, for my worship not to be contaminated, I've got to understand what's written there is as much for me as it was for them. Right? Then I have to check the doctrines that I believe and make sure that what I've been taught lines up with what Yahweh actually said. In John 4:22, Messiah said to the woman of Samaria, you worship you know not what. In Mark chapter 7, he confronts the Pharisees. Listen to this, Mark 7:5. The Pharisees and scribes ask him, why walk not your disciples according to the tradition of the elders, but they eat bread with unwashed hands? He answered and said unto them, well has Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their heart's far from me. Listen to what Messiah said to them. What he said to these men, boy, he's bold. He heard their question and he said to them, you know what, if somebody just listens to the words coming out of your mouth, you guys sound spiritual. If all anybody ever did was just listen to what you're saying, they would think that you love Yahweh. Your words seem to convey that you have great fear and respect and love, But actually you're hypocrites. What's a hypocrite? An actor. You're just pretending. What you're doing is part of some script that you've been taught by somebody else. Your hearts are actually far from Yahweh, he said. If your heart was connected with Yahweh, you'd be less concerned with what the elders handed down to you and more concerned with what Torah said to you. Listen to him in verse 7. Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. The word vain there means to unsuccessfully search for something. In vain means to unsuccessfully search for Yahweh in your worship, but to be unable to find Him. Your worship, he says, is empty and useless. How did it get that way? It got that way because your worship of Yahweh became contaminated. How did it become contaminated? The doctrines that you've been taught and you believe came from the commandments of men, not from Yahweh. Proverbs 4:2 says, "For I give you good doctrine, forsake ye not Torah." Any doctrine that has anybody forsaking Torah is not good doctrine. Follow Torah. That's good doctrine. Well, how can we know if our worship of Yahweh is contaminated and in vain? It takes sometimes a lifelong search of testing everything you believe against what's written in Torah. Do I believe this because some man taught it, or do I believe this because Yahweh said it? Let me say this, and I am coming to a close. I am convinced that after you become aware that you need a Savior and you turn to the Messiah, then the rest of your walk hinges on whether you will accept the Sabbath or not. If you reject the Sabbath, then your walk will quickly become contaminated. It will become a contaminated form of worship that is following a false Greek Messiah. Because if you reject the Sabbath, you're following a Messiah who you say is teaching you to reject Torah. Right. If you accept the Sabbath, then your walk will become a journey where the Ruach HaKodesh can guide you into all truth. I think everybody that I've ever talked to who is now seeking with all of their heart to be Torah observant, it always begins with Sabbath. Go to Exodus 31. The Sabbath is immensely important, is what I'm trying to say. If you're going to walk with Yahweh and your worship is not going to be in vain or contaminated. Exodus 31 verse 12. And Yahweh spake unto Moses, saying, oracles, that is his oracles, his utterances, right? Yes, sir. Yahweh spoke unto Moses, saying, this is what Yahweh said. These are his words that were committed to the Jews through Moses. So we ought to pay heed to what he said. Speak thou also unto the children of Israel, saying, verily my Sabbath you shall keep, for it is what? It's a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am Yahweh that does sanctify you. You shall keep the Sabbath therefore, for it's holy unto you. Everyone that defiles it shall surely be put to death. Whoever does any work therein, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days may work be done, but the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to Yahweh. Whosoever does any work in the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Wherefore the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations for a perpetual, never-ending covenant. Verse 17. It's a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days Yahweh made heaven and earth, and on the seventh day He rested and was refreshed. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. Go back to what Yeshua said in John 4:22. Salvation is of the Jews. So if He committed to them His oracles, and I'm going to follow the Messiah that He gave to them and receive salvation and rescue from Him, then I need to know that Yahweh said the sign between me and you, that we're connected in covenant, is that you keep the Sabbath. The word sign means a beacon, a flag, or evidence. So the evidence that you're worshiping Yahweh is that you keep the Sabbath. The flag that waves, that shows you're worshiping Yahweh, is the Sabbath. Now, once you do that, then the Ruach HaKodesh will begin to teach you other truth, but it starts there. I am convinced that after you become aware that you need a Savior, turn to the Messiah, the rest of your walk hinges on your acceptance of that fact. I am further convinced that once you accept the Sabbath as being a sign, that the very next thing the Ruach HaKodesh begins to teach you is about the difference between clean and unclean. To ignore Yahweh's instruction about what to eat or not to eat is an insult to Him. How is your worship not going to be contaminated if you think, I don't have to listen to what He says about what I can eat? It was a very thing that happened in the garden, right? You shall eat of every tree, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the midst of the garden you shall not eat. What did the devil say to Kava? They call her Eva, not Eva. Sorry about that, sweetheart. What did the devil say, Satan say, the serpent say to Kava, who is called Eve? Did he really say you shall not eat? Huh. Now, I understand that the forbidden tree was a tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but the principle remains Yahweh has a right to tell us what we can and cannot eat. It started in the garden. And if we refuse His right to tell us what we can and cannot eat, then we're also going to question everything else He commands us to do. I really get irked when I hear people who have finally decided to obey Leviticus 11 and to take out of their diet those things that are written there because they read some study by some scientist or some doctor that proved that all of the things written in Leviticus 11 that we're forbidden to eat are really bad for you. So, from time to time you'll hear somebody who has decided, since some scientist said that pig and shrimp and oyster are dangerously bad for you, they now are willing to come and say, okay, Yahweh, now I see why you told me not to eat that, so I'm going to obey you now. You know, it ought to be right the opposite of that. We should obey whether we understand it or not. We should put more confidence in what He said, whether any doctor or scientist ever agrees with it or not. Not say, well, since this doctor agrees with you, I'm going to do it. Since this scientist agreed with it, I'm going to do it. In Genesis, if you go back and read that story, you'll see it says that Eva, wow. You'll see that Eve, it says, she saw that tree was good for food. No, it wasn't good for food. How do we know it wasn't good for food? Yahweh said, you shall not eat of it. Not good for food. Well, people do the same thing. They look at bacon and they see it's good for food. You hear it frying in a pan. It's good for food. They see a lobster on a plate and say, it looks good for food. I like what I've heard Brian say before. It's kind of crazy because if a person was to walk out in their garage at night, turn the light on and see lobsters running across the garage floor, they wouldn't say, oh boy, let's catch one of those and eat it. They'd move. Right. What's invaded my house? Let's move. Right? But because it comes out of an ocean, somebody puts it in an aquarium and then cooks it up for you, people look at it and think, ooh, that looks good for food, especially if I dip it in butter. But those things are not good for food. How do we know they're not good for food? Because Yahweh said so. Yahweh said, leave those things alone. I'm convinced that if a person is going to learn the deeper truths of Torah, it begins with accepting the Sabbath as a sign, and it begins with accepting the dietary instruction in Leviticus 11 as being imperative. Let me tell you why I think dietary instruction found in Leviticus 11 is so important. What was the abomination of desecration? You remember? Antiochus Epiphanes, when he came into Jerusalem to desecrate the temple, what did he do? He set up an idol or a statue of Zeus, and then he sacrificed pigs on the altar. That's what he did. When he was trying to bring the people of the land under his control, what was it that he tried to get Mattathias and every other person in that region? What did he command that they do to show their allegiance to him instead of to Yahweh? They had to eat pig. Must be important. What you eat reveals the Elohim you serve. Maybe it's more accurate to say it this way. What you refuse to eat reveals the Elohim that you serve. Mattathias was just said, listen, man, there's no need in you and all these people dying. Just take a bite of this bacon. That's all you got to do. And he would have rather died than do it. Must be important. If you think you can eat anything you want and that it's all clean to you, you're not worshiping Yahweh. You worship you know not what. And you're worshiping vain because you're following doctrines that come from the commandments of men. Antiochus is not the only reason I believe that what we eat is so important. Look in Acts 15. Acts 15 verse 20. But that we write unto them, that is the converts from the Gentile nations. This is the conclusion of what we're going to tell these new converts from Gentile nations. We write unto them that they abstain from pollutions of idols, and from fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood. For Moses of old time has in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. Gentiles are being converted. They know nothing about Torah. What are we going to do with all of these new Gentile converts? They're no longer Gentiles. They've been brought in, but they came from Gentiles. They know nothing about Torah. What are we going to do with them? They had to come up with a plan. Here's the plan they came up with. Notice that they are already committed to keeping the Sabbath. So that's not brought up. We don't have to convince them to keep the Sabbath. That's number one. They are already sold on that. Because they're in the synagogue every Sabbath. Right? You know what it says? Yes, sir. Notice the next things that we're told. We're told 4 things that they are required immediately. These new converts are required immediately to do. 2 of those 4 have something to do with food. Possibly 3 of the 4. Who you worship is revealed by what you will and will not eat. So as these converts coming in, they're going to be in the synagogue every Sabbath. That's expected of them. And in this, as they come into the synagogue, they're going to be taught Torah. That's expected, but that's going to take time. But immediately, we need them to stop doing these 4 things, and 3 of them probably had to do with food. We know that eating things strangled, that has to do with food. Eating blood, that has to do with food. The pollution of idols, this could be a reference to having graven images. It could be a reference to rituals associated with these graven images, but it also can and is used as a reference to meat that gets offered in sacrifice to idols. That's the reason that when Paul goes back to the assemblies that he sets up, he has to start talking to them about how that if they know that meat came from an animal that was sacrificed to a false god, that it was actually sacrificed to a demon, and that they're not to eat it because it's polluted. So this pollution of idols could be a reference to meat. So it's very likely and very possible that 3 of the 4 instructions for new believers coming out of Gentile nations has to do with food. So how important is food? Vitally. I'll give you another reason it's important. Go to Isaiah 66. On the great day of Yahweh, the great day of judgment that Yom Kippur pictures for us that is coming. Listen to Isaiah's description of what's going to happen on the day of Yahweh. Isaiah 66, look in verse 15. For behold, Yahweh will come with fire and with his chariots like a whirlwind, to render his anger with fury and his rebuke with flames of fire. Not the Elohim we hear getting preached, is it? Verse 16. For by fire and by his sword will Yahweh plead with all flesh, and the slain of Yahweh shall be many. Verse 17. They that sanctify themselves and purify themselves in the gardens behind one tree in the midst, eating swine's flesh, and the abomination, and the mouse, shall be consumed together, saith Yahweh. Here's the point of verse 17. People are sanctifying themselves for worship, not knowing many times that it's pagan worship they're purifying themselves for. But the evidence that they're not worshiping Yahweh is in what they're eating. They're eating swine's flesh and the abomination. Go look in Leviticus 11 and see how many times it uses the word abomination referring to certain animals that we're not to eat. And the mouse, Leviticus 11:29 says this, these also shall be unclean unto you among the creeping things that creep upon the earth, the weasel, the mouse, and the tortoise. It is an insult to Yahweh to call him our Elohim, but to disregard what he says about what we can and cannot eat. If a person's religion has taught them that they can disregard the Sabbath and that they can eat whatever they want to eat, their worship is contaminated and it is in vain. Some 7 or 8 weeks ago, I heard in my spirit, the sins of Samaria, the sins of America. That's what I heard. I didn't know what it meant. I just knew I was to study it. My study had carried me to 1 Kings and 2 Kings and to John chapter 4. And these passages begin to reveal to me that the sins of Samaria and the sins of America are identical. And the sin is basically, it can be summarized and nutshelled in this statement. The sins of both are simply this: their worship of Yahweh is contaminated. It's the mingling of pagan rituals with an attempt to worship the true Elohim. Samaria is a land occupied by Gentiles who were taught false doctrine concerning salvation and worship. America is a land occupied by Gentiles who are not being taught that salvation is of the Jews. Samaritans worship and laid claim to a Judeo heritage. They claimed a connection to Jacob. They claimed a connection to the Elohim of Israel, but they weren't following the instruction of Torah. America also lays claim to a Judeo heritage. It claims to worship the Elohim of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but its churches are filled with men and women who have been taught to reject any instruction from Torah. The sins of Samaria are the sins of America. And as the weight of this began to sit on my soul, I pondered, well, Yahweh, what am I to do with this? Okay, I see that they're identical, but what am I to do? I have no voice to turn America. What am I to do with what you've shown me? And as those questions rose in my spirit, the answer came quickly to me, and it's found in Acts chapter 2. Father, what am I to do with what you're showing me about the sins of Samaria and the sins of America? Here is the answer given. When the day of Pentecost was fully come, Peter had preached. And after the people heard him preach, verse 37, it says, now when they heard this, they were pricked in their heart. And they said to Peter and to the rest of the apostles, men and brethren, what shall we do? Peter said unto them, repent, be baptized, every one of you, in the name of Yeshua HaMashiach, for the remission of sins, and you shall receive the gift of the Ruach HaKodesh. For the promise is unto you and to your children and to all that are afar off, even as many as Yahweh our Elohim shall call. And with many other words did he testify and exhort, saying, save yourselves from this untoward generation. There is the answer with the information we've been given about the sins of Samaria, the sins of America. Save yourself from this warped generation. It may or may not be too late for America. That's yet to be seen. There may or may not be anything that you or I can do to help America. That's yet to be seen. But it's not too late for you. Save yourself. Don't go another day walking in a contaminated religion, participating in contaminated worship. Save yourself. The cry in Revelation is, come out of her, my people, that you be not partakers of her sin. Yahweh bless you and keep you. Yahweh make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. Yahweh lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. As his name is put upon you, so does he bless you. Hallelujah.